Hello everyone, this is Jason from Shy Snake, and I wanted to talk a bit about how we use RTC in the development of our game Spy DNA. So for those who don't know background, Spy DNA is a simulation RPG. So we put a lot of effort into making a really realistic combat system and world, and the player, as they play their way through it, will get to interact with a lot of NPCs. They'll do a lot of talking to other characters. There's a lot of different items in the game that you can experience. So we had to do a lot of creation of different items and different dialogues for the game. So I'll start with the items because those are fairly straightforward. So on the screen right now, you see we have opened this thing called Oxalana's phone. In the terms of our game, it's called an item. An item is just anything that can be inside a player's inventory. So you can see on the right, it has a number of things. It's got a name, that's obviously the name of what it's called, and it's got a description. So that is when you're in the inventory and you want to see a detailed information about the item, what shows up. There's also room for a tooltip, which is if you mouse over the item, it just pops up a little extra information without having to select it. And you can also see weight, how much it weighs in the character's inventory. So this is all pretty basic stuff. And if I go to one of these more complex items, in this case, this is under clothing, you see it actually over here on the right has both an item, which is everything we were just talking about, but it's also got this thing called item clothing. So this is extra information for that specific type of item. In this case, it's a heavy combat suit, which provides a lot of armor to the players. And you can see where we've entered the values for different parts of the armor. Now, the way we set this up in RTC was down here in this thing called features, and also templates, but we'll talk about features first. So in the feature file, we actually created this. So we can edit a series of fields. So for those familiar with C++, this is the equivalent to variables in a class, or members in a class. And that lets you basically add things into the object. In this case, we had a different description. Those are just coming from over here. So I could drag over another text field if I wanted. And then I could set the values, whether I wanted it to be required, what I wanted to call it, if it needed a default value, for example. So this is how we set up the templates that we use inside RTC to work with our game. Now, when we start the game, we actually load from RTC this information. And we use it to populate and instance our C++ classes that represent this over on the game side. So effectively, we go up here and we do an export or quick export, where that tells RTC to write out a XML file that contains all those objects in our game. And then when you run the game, it actually loads that XML file, and that's what it uses to create all those C++ objects that the actual game engine runs and uses. The nice thing about that is we can have a very user-friendly GUI editor, and we actually pay no performance cost on the back end for having done so, because it's turned into very native C++ objects before we actually access it at runtime. So this gives you an idea how we edited the item, but if I go down to the next thing called item clothing, you see we have a whole bunch of different fields for the various bits of armor, but for each of the different types of items that you might have in inventory, and this isn't a complete list, it's just where we're at the moment, you can see it has all these different fields. For instance, the mechanism for the weapons actually have these things called strips where you can drag in different, in this case it would be down here under infos, descriptions of how the gun works and what kind of magazines it could accept. And I can show you what those look like in practice after you've edited them. So I open one of these. So this is one of our automatic pistols in the game. So you can see it has that information in the item that we were talking about. But it also has an item weapon. That's basically anything that the player can use in combat. And then specifically, it's of type gun, which basically means it's a ranged weapon with a sight and mechanisms for firing. In this case, we have some extra information we drug onto it. So this describes what kind of rate of fire the weapon has, and I could actually double-click that and you could go see that information. It's a different class of object, but that's where we set up for single shot or full auto, all that little information you need. So that's how we entered the items in the game. But probably the biggest advantage we got from RTC was in dialogue editing. So we had previously an in-game editor which we used to create all these items, and that actually worked pretty well for us. What didn't work so well in our world before we made the change to RTC was dialogue editing. And so I'm going to go into an example of our dialogue now. So this is an example dialogue from one of the missions that we shipped in our demo. You can see it's actually fairly complicated. I'll keep zooming out till you can see the whole thing. So each of these boxes with the portrait is representing something the player could say. You see some of these other boxes which just have a icon on them. Those are NPCs. We just haven't entered all the portraits for the NPCs, just simply because it's a little extra work to do that and wasn't really necessary. So I'll go through a bit of how this works. So when you start the dialogue with the NPCs, this line for Igor or Egolf is the first thing they say to you, and then you'll get some options to respond. But the options you have to respond will depend on a few things. And so this generates the dialogue on the screen, but we're using the RTC nodes for conditions. And in this case, we're using the built-in scripting language in RTC, but we've extended that to provide our own checks in-game. So in this case, we're checking, I'll zoom in a little so you can see it better. So first we're checking to see if the commander is a male or female character. And then down here, we're checking to see if a specific NPC is in the party. And based on the result of those checks, you can see the green or red, meaning it passed, you made the check or you did not. We go to a couple different things. In this case, if you're male, we go directly to the hub where it's basically the primary place where you start your talk. If not, you get an extra little dialogue down here where he makes some comments. And in this case, we actually are using an instruction node so that if you had this player in your party, we set a couple flags, or in this case variables, not flags, so that you get a small bonus to your negotiation. I'm looking over to the right because I'm trying to find where we actually start responding to your actions. Here's some good examples. So this one, you see it says ARPS dialogue. What we're doing is changing the response that character has to a dialogue input. In this case, we're setting the character to no longer respond to your dialogue because apparently you've upset him at that point. And you see down here is the opposite of that. These ARPS inventory commands are telling the NPC in Golf to give the character some items. And so I'm going to open this thing up, hopefully. And you can see we've actually modified the instruction node so that it has a few slots where we can attach things he could give. So in this case, he can give you anti-aircraft missiles, he can give you a supplier info, depending on how well you succeeded. So that should give everyone an idea how we use RTC in the development of SpyDNA here at ShySnake. For those interested, take a look at spydna.com or shysnake.com and you can learn more about the game. And thanks to everyone for listening and watching.